Year 10 and welcome to this week's edition of your English Literature podcast. Today we are going to be talking about the poem The Farmer's Bride by Charlotte Mew. With you today are your hosts Miss Beaumont,
Mr. Amal
and Mr. Rafi.
Okay, so hopefully you've read a little bit about the poem, hopefully you've got a general gist of it, but we're just going to talk about it quickly now to see what each of the three of us thinks this poem is about. Who'd like to start us off?
Yeah, essentially, the first reading of this text, it's about a wife who is trying to escape maybe the patriarchal grasp of society, or maybe even just an abusive husband. It's all up to interpretations. And it's about the realization and dealing of a lack of love and passion perhaps in a relationship, and the husband is trying to deal with these emotions in the best way that he can. I generally feel this poem is, there's definitely a sense of emptiness. There's also a sense of rebellion as well. The fact that she tried to escape, and she tried to escape the confines. And maybe also a cry for help of just accepting that this is the rights of women and we're not really going to escape this.
Because, that word patriarchy, the fact that they lived in a society that was so dominated by men, it's kind of significant, isn't it, that this poem, the speaker is a man. It's not told from the woman's point of view, it's told from the man's point of view. And I feel this is just a deep sense of frustration. He is just frustrated that this woman isn't doing what he wants her to do. I've married her, so therefore she should now do as I say.
Yep. And with regards to frustration, it can technically work both ways. If we talk about the bride herself, or perhaps Charlotte Mew's own voice that comes across through the speaker, maybe she's frustrated in the fact that she's in a relationship with a person that she didn't choose. Because if you look at who chose who, it was I chose my maid. So it was the farmer who actually had the control and power of the possession as well of this woman. So she must be frustrated, and that's why she's made these attempts to run away from this whole situation.
So let's start off today by talking a little bit about Charlotte Mew herself and her context. Who'd like to start us off?
Well, firstly, it's quite interesting to know that Charlotte herself was a lesbian, and during that time period it wasn't accepted, it was taboo. But she also had quite a traumatic childhood. A lot of her siblings died, 3. She had a couple of her family members had to go to psychiatric institutions, and there was this desire not to pass it on to further generations, and almost like this curse. So that was one of the reasons why she didn't procreate as well.
So the idea that she had this really, really traumatic childhood with 2 siblings ending up in what would have been called an insane asylum at the time, but these days would call it a psychiatric institution, you can see how she might have felt really that she couldn't live as free a life as other people. Thinking about critics, how might some of the critics that we study perhaps read into this poem? Any ideas?
So we're assuming that you guys have read it, and hopefully you should have, and hopefully you understand what's going on in the poem. So if we look at a Freudian reading of the desires that come through Charlotte Mew or the speaker within the poem, we can see that her desires are quite suppressed. So we can see from the bride's perspective that she's trying to break free from these sort of shackles of this marriage, and this might very closely link to the fact that her sexual sort of lifestyle wasn't accepted. So it links very closely to the shackles of society, the social constraints, and this might be a way of her to express these emotions without actually causing issues within the society and getting in trouble for it. So this is perhaps her way of expressing her emotional desires.
So sort of starting to think a little bit deeper then about the language and the structure in the poem. I mean, straight away, looking through the poem, I've noticed that animals are a key vocabulary theme. We've got references to birds, references to rabbits, a leveret, which is a baby hare, a mouse. And if you think about all of those animals, what do they all have in common? Well, they're all vulnerable, they're all prey animals, they're animals that other animals will eat and prey on. So when we're thinking about how that relates to the bride herself, perhaps that shows that she's feeling very vulnerable. She's almost feeling dehumanized herself, like she isn't being treated as an equal, as a human being.
Yeah, continuing with that idea, on line 13, we've got her wide brown stare, almost like a deer caught between headlights, sort of a really intimidated, frightened little thing, maybe feeling a little bit lost wherever she is. She doesn't feel very comfortable where she is. Maybe that's the reason she's running away all the time. Maybe that's the reason why she's so frustrated and she can't connect with this person that she's calling her husband. So yes, so it's not strong animals. It's always prey animals, vulnerable animals that is being compared, or she's being compared to, and that's really important.
And just linking that to the second, the farm folk chase her down, literally chasing her just like an animal would chase its prey. What about the use of colour in the poem then? Any ideas about that? Because there's quite a few references, isn't there? Particularly towards the end of the poem. We've got the colours black, we've got the colour white, we've got the colour red as well being referenced in reference to Christmas time.
Yeah, particularly there's quite a distinct use of colours. So especially in line, I believe line 38 and line 39, like you were saying, there's this clear juxtaposition of black and white that on a base level you can maybe argue that they are polar opposites and they weren't meant to be together. And also you can maybe argue that one is signifying purity and hope and desire, whereas there's this overwhelming evil perhaps that's trying to consume her. Definitely I believe that the use of berries and Christmas, normally associated with joy, unity, family, it may be used in an ironic sense, in the sense that he hasn't got that joy, unity, because the connotations of red are passion and that sexual, maybe even deeper. But clearly he has that lack and he's almost questioning it, reading up to Christmas and what's Christmas time? So even this festivity of joy doesn't really give him that joy in life, because maybe early on, like you were saying, that he hasn't got control over his wife. So now the whole world to him is in polar opposites because he's not a patriarchal man in this situation.
And also, when you talked about the colour of red and the positive connotations of lust and love and passion, we've also got the negative connotations of red. So maybe that's the reason why we sort of image, we have an image of perhaps pain or fright, danger. Maybe these are warning signs for the bride herself, which is why she's not very comfortable, not very happy being where she is, and she's always looking for a way out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Christmas time, you think about Christmas time as being a time for children, but if you think about the Christmas story as well, it is a story that is literally all about a birth. And one of the biggest frustrations that the farmer has is not just that his desire is unmet, but if she will not have sex with him, that means that she will not provide him any children. And we've got to remember that the time that we were written in, that this poem was written in, that was really the sole purpose almost of marriage in many ways. And we can also link that back really nicely to context. Remember, Simone de Beauvoir herself chose not to have children, perhaps worried that she would pass these psychiatric conditions onto her own children, and maybe that's an echo of her own frustration that she could not bear children as well. So there's some really nice links that we could make there. What about the use of punctuation? Because I think there's some quite interesting uses of punctuation here.
We've got quite a few exclamation marks, especially towards the end of the poem. Clearly we can see that this farmer is really frustrated because of this desire for his bride that is not being reciprocated. Obviously we know that he wants children because he's already mentioned that. We already know that she's not in the same place, or doesn't feel the same way towards him as he does, and we know that he's very passionate towards her. So these cries almost for help really show the level of his desire and his frustrations towards the situation that not only she's sort of stuck in, but he feels like he's sort of stuck and he doesn't really know what to do now.
Yeah, that's really reinforced as well by the repetition, isn't it? In the last line, her eyes, her hair, really just reinforces that exclamation.
Yeah.
I think the title of the poem is really interesting as well. The fact that it's the farmer's bride, and the use of that apostrophe. It's a possessive apostrophe, isn't it? It signifies that the bride belongs to the farmer. So again, that really highlights the lack of power that she perhaps has and the power that he feels he should have over her, or the ownership that he should have over her.
100%, and it's immediately reinforced by the first line that says, I chose the bride. So he has, at that point, all the power and she has none. So we can really see the sort of power imbalance between the two.
Interesting though, isn't it, that at the end of the poem, she's the person who's actually setting those boundaries for him. She's the person who, at the end of the poem, in the last stanza, she is in the attic. She's at the top of the stairs. That's where she sleeps. Alone, poor maid, he says. And actually, if you think about perhaps the symbolism of that, and the attic is perhaps a space that she's created for herself. On the other hand, you could look at it another way. Perhaps the attic almost represents the cage that she has been trapped in, that she's almost had to create for herself because of the danger perceived that she feels from the farmer. So we could perhaps think about the use of that as well. What about the form of the poem? So what could we say if we were thinking, if we were really aiming high and thinking not just about structure, but about the overall form?
I definitely think there's a chaotic form, and it reflects that maybe she's feeling her wild self. I do feel like it is definitely a cry for help. Definitely there's this sense of like animalistic imagery. And I was also just looking at this listing, following from what you're saying about the first stanza and the title itself. I definitely see, if we look at the poem as a whole, the fact that the farmer's bride is possessiveness, and then the I used straight away in the first stanza. And maybe in the last stanza, she just gains that little bit of freedom from the poem as itself, like starting off in patriarchal and maybe ending with maybe her own enclosure of freedom. But perhaps, like you were saying, you could, again, represent that even though she's physically away, she still is entrapped, and this chaos will start from the end and continue as we go along.
Because there is rhyme, isn't there? It's not like this poem is written completely in free verse, because it's not. There is rhyme within there. There are rhyming triplets at various points. There is alternating rhyme at various points.
Yeah.
But it is all over the place, as is the structure of the stanzas themselves. So perhaps, I mean, maybe that's because it's a contract, it's a combination of the farmer's desire for this normal, everyday, regulated life, and her wildness that is perhaps disrupting that structure. So if we were aiming for the highest grades, perhaps that's something that we could think about, thinking about commenting on the form of the poem overall as well. Finally then, I suppose we should have a think about, if this poem came up in the exam, what other poems would we want to link this to? What would be some strong links that we could make?
Well, that's one of the reasons this poem is very, very good. There's a whole list of poems that you can compare this one to. One of the ones we can look at straight off the bat, the one you've already read, Porphyria's Lover, we can see the controlling side, and we can understand very, very clearly that this is from the male's perspective. Porphyria's lover, almost like a possession, just as the farmer's bride. We can see feelings of frustration and sort of passionate and very almost forceful, not so much perhaps in Farmer's Bride than in Porphyria's Lover, but forceful and quite aggressive, passionate feelings of desire. Absolutely.
And on that note of desire, Sonnet 29 as well would be a really good poem to link it to, because although her desire is much more positive, and of course it's from a woman's perspective and not a man's, there is still that sense of desire. There is still that sense of frustration as well, of desire sexually for someone that she cannot have. So that would be a really strong link as well. Anything else, Mr. Emma?
I would definitely say Neutral Tones is a great poem to link this to. It's also it's a poem you can question the validity of the narrator. We don't know the actual situation in which they find their partners, if there is a partner, or whether it's all an ideology inside their head. But the clear natural imagery of grey and this natural imagery of maybe prey, it's very clear links that you can make, in the sense that there's this like predatory lack of emotion, lack of colour, that maybe could stem from the fact that they're not, again, fulfilling their like almost patriarchal right of controlling a situation. I feel like there's definitely this ideology that there's an innate desire to control women. And if you don't, then you're clearly not a man. And then if you're not a man, then what is the purpose of your life? What is the point of this colour? Everything should be grey and ash, because you're not doing what should be expected of you, perhaps.
Definitely, yeah. The use of colour, absolutely, is a really clear, striking similarity in the language used in the poems, isn't it? and that male perspective and the rejection that both the males feel, the speakers in that poem feel.
It's almost a feeling of like entitlement from the man, like I should be entitled to this, or reciprocate feeling or something, but it doesn't always work like that, does it?
Yeah, definitely. And one other poem that obviously shows a really strong feeling of rejection as well is Love's Philosophy,
Yeah.
where he uses natural imagery to express really clear frustration about how the object of his affections doesn't reciprocate that, doesn't see them back, and that's a really clear parallel as well to The Farmer's Bride.
Yeah, and it adds to the same, or very similar frustrations of why do you not love me? Why do you not feel the same way towards me? And that really, really links to some of the main ideas of Farmer's Bride, and how the way he feels that his bride doesn't offer the same emotions or even similar emotions to how he feels towards her.
Yeah, there's definitely this, if you look at the title, this philosophy of love, they all have their own variety of different way of looking at love, but there's always this sense of what I was saying, what Miss Beaumont was saying earlier, this rejection. Rejection is clearly one of those themes where each person deals with it in a different manner. Killing perhaps and having that ownership of a physical body, questioning and maybe just making complete opposites in their lives to make themselves feel apart. Definitely something that you can look at in more detail.
Absolutely. We really hope this has been helpful for you, Year 10. Bye-bye.
Bye guys.